You probably carried one, small, orange, made of cardboard. You'd shake it walking up someone's driveway, and the coins would rattle around inside. The person who answered the door would fish in their pocket and drop in a dime or a quarter. It was Halloween, and you were trick or treating for UNICEF.
Yeah, I was about 8, I think. The box made me feel like I was doing something real.
Actually, you were. That box, across 75 years and hundreds of millions of kids who carried it, has raised nearly $200 million, which is remarkable on its own. But here's what I kept thinking about when I was deep in the research for this episode. The orange box is not the most interesting thing about UNICEF.
The most interesting thing is what the box represents. UNICEF was created by the United Nations in 1946 for a short-term emergency that was supposed to end after 3 years. It was supposed to close in 1949, and instead, it's still here, operating globally with billions a year, and it won the Nobel Peace Prize.
It runs on voluntary contributions, no dues, no mandatory assessments. No government anywhere is required to fund UNICEF.
Which is why people ask a fair question. If it is part of the UN, why does it sound like a nonprofit?
Because it's a UN body with a nonprofit style operating mode. It was created by the UN General Assembly, not incorporated like a normal charity, but it is mission driven, has a governing board, and is funded by volunteer donors, and focuses on humanitarian programs rather than generating a profit. It also has national affiliates like UNICEF USA that are traditional nonprofit organizations.
Today, we are asking how that actually works at scale. Where does the money come from? What happens when one major donor pulls back? And is the funding architecture that carried UNICEF through 80 years still fit for the next 80?
Views are ours alone, not our employers, not our clients, not anyone we've ever worked for.
We fact check against primary sources and correct mistakes, so if you catch something, tell us. We are not affiliated with, endorsed by, or sponsored by any organization we cover. I'm Revi Sterling.
And I'm Melissa Stern, and this is Impact. I want to take you back to December 11th, 1946. The UN General Assembly passes a resolution unanimously, and UNICEF is born. The mandate is narrow and urgent: get food, clothing, and medicine to children in war-ravaged Europe. And when I say urgent, the winter of 1946 to 1947 was one of the harshest in modern European history. Millions of children across many countries were in serious danger: malnutrition, disease, and displacement. The person who had been pushing for something like this since 1943 was a Polish doctor named Ludwik Reichmann. He published an article in Free World magazine in September 1943 called A United Nations Health Service. Why not? And he spent the next 3 years lobbying everyone he could find. When the resolution passed, he became the first chairman of UNICEF's executive board. And the first executive director, the person who actually ran it, was Maurice Pate, an American businessman and former relief worker who had helped feed more than 1 million Polish children after World War I. Pate agreed to take the job on one condition.
Which was?
That UNICEF served children without politics, no side-taking. His line was, "There are no enemy children."
That is an extraordinary principle to establish at the founding. And not naive, it was strategic. That neutrality is what gave UNICEF access across the Cold War, through Korea, through proxy conflicts across Africa and Latin America, in contexts that would have shut out almost any other organization.
In 1953, UNICEF became permanent, and the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund dropped the words international and emergency. Emergency was dropped because it became permanent, and international was dropped because they thought it was redundant as a UN agency. But they kept the acronym. It had already become the brand. A little more of the origin story before we dive into the business model. 1949, a 7-year-old girl named Jika Samkova lives in Czechoslovakia. Her village had received UNICEF aid after the war, milk and medicine. She painted a picture of children dancing around a maypole, and with the help of her teacher, sent it as a thank you to the UNICEF Bureau in Prague. It then traveled from Prague to Vienna, and then a UNICEF staffer named Grace Holmes Barbie carried it back to New York. And someone in the New York office had the idea to turn it into a greeting card. They printed it as a limited run, about 500 copies that first year, initially just for the staff and then for the public. And from that one painting, UNICEF built one of the most successful nonprofit product lines in history.
What did it actually generate?
By 1983, the greeting card operation was bringing in $50 million a year from 115 million cards at a 50% profit margin.
50%. Most commercial card companies would love a 20% return.
Yep. There were three things that drove the margin. First, donated art. Over time, more than 2,600 artists from 140 countries contributed rights to their work. Picasso actually gave them a tapestry design called Haven, and Chagall and Matisse gave others.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it kept the product costs very low. Second, they had a volunteer sales network, about 50,000 unpaid workers worldwide. In Europe, cards were sold through banks and post offices. Beautiful for margins, but terrible for consistency. And third, there was mission alignment. Buying a UNICEF card was a statement about who you were.
And what about the card operation today?
There's a formal hallmark partnership that has raised over $27 million since 2006. It's more reliable, but the old volunteer magic is gone.
And in total?
Over 4 billion cards sold since 1949. At its peak, $55 to $60 million a year globally.
I remember the cards and, of course, the orange boxes, but I didn't know how the boxes came to be. It was all about a woman named Mary Emma Allison. She was a school teacher and a school librarian in Philadelphia. And in the late 1940s, she was shopping at Wanamaker's department store when she came across a parade of children. She followed them to a UNICEF booth collecting donations for powdered milk for children in need after the war. A philanthropist named Gertrude Ely, a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt's, was there and told her all about UNICEF's work. So Mary Emma went home and told her husband.
Okay, who was her husband?
Her husband is Clyde Allison, a Presbyterian minister who edited a nationally distributed Sunday school curriculum. You can tell where this is headed. And after handing out candy one Halloween night, Mary Emma turned to her husband and son and said, "It's too bad we can't turn this into something good." So in advance of Halloween 1950, she wrote an appeal asking children to collect spare change for UNICEF. And Clyde published it in his newsletter, which went out to Sunday school programs around the country. And that is how Trick or Treat for UNICEF was born.
How much did they raise in that first year?
Only $17, but it was a start. And by 1951, UNICEF USA had noticed and formalized it into a national program. Orange boxes, public service announcements, and organized school distribution. Their daughter Diane even wrote a Trick or Treat for UNICEF song. And the program still exists, though the format has changed. UNICEF USA now runs it with physical boxes and digital options.
Mary Emma Allison, nearly 200 million lifetime total from Trick or Treat for UNICEF, starting with only $17. That's a pretty good run.
You know, it's really the organizational structure that makes the orange box and the greeting card possible at a global scale. One of the most underappreciated design decisions in the whole story. UNICEF doesn't raise private money through a single central office. Instead, it works through independent national committees, nonprofit organizations authorized to fundraise in UNICEF's name and pass the proceeds on to UNICEF.
How many are there of those?
There are 33 national committees today across Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia. UNICEF USA is the oldest, founded in 1947 by Helenka Pantaleone, and originally and still called the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. It says it's raised about $12 billion since then, including gifts in kind. The model has real advantages. It pushes fundraising overhead off UNICEF's own books. The committees cover their own costs, and they bring in local celebrities, local corporate partners, and local media.
Is there a trade-off?
The trade-off is consistency. Some of the national committees are excellent, others less so. The independence that makes them so locally responsive also means that they can go in directions that central UNICEF might not have approved. There are two examples worth naming, one where UNICEF came out very well, and one where the situation was much more complicated.
Tell me the good one first.
Okay, we'll start with Tesco in Ireland. Tesco used Change for Good, a phrase associated with UNICEF's in-flight collection campaigns, in a commercial advertising campaign. They borrowed the charitable association without authorization. UNICEF publicly objected, and the situation turned into a fundraising partnership. And UNICEF turned a brand encroachment into a fundraising relationship. That's an elegant reversal.
That's pretty cool. And the complicated one?
The 2005 Belgian Smurfs campaign. UNICEF's Belgian committee wanted to raise money for former child soldiers in Burundi and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but donor fatigue had set in. So they came back with one of the most shocking nonprofit ads ever made. The Smurfs' village is bombed in an airstrike. Papa Smurf cradles a dying baby Smurf. The whole village burns.
Wait, what the heck? Bomb the Smurfs? What were they smoking?
Exactly. The idea was to jolt adults through childhood memory, to make war feel personal, not abstract. But the fallout was immediate and significant. The ad sparked international outrage and mainstream news coverage and a sustained public debate over whether a UNICEF-linked campaign had crossed a line. It aired late at night specifically so children would not see it, and the UNICEF headquarters in New York did not publicly embrace the campaign. The backlash underscored how much latitude the national committees had, and how much reputational exposure that latitude created for the global brand.
So the interesting thing is not just that UNICEF raises money in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. It's that each method diversifies UNICEF's fund base, but also diversifies, or in some cases, introduces new risks. Before we go further, I want to answer a question I kept coming back to while researching this. When someone writes a check to UNICEF USA, where does that money actually go?
Well, I think a lot of people assumes it stays in the US, or at least in the country where the National Committee is based.
Actually, it doesn't. UNICEF's USA Form 990 makes this clear. Its core program activity is grant making. In 2024 alone, it contributed $137 million directly to UNICEF, which made it one of UNICEF's top 3 private sector partners worldwide. And when you include all its grant making that year, funding to NGO partners beyond UNICEF headquarters, it disbursed over $590 million in total.
So it's not just a pass-through to headquarters.
Right. It's got its own board and makes its own grant decisions. The money flows to UNICEF programs globally, those dealing with health, nutrition, education, emergency response, wherever UNICEF operates, plus other NGOs based on board priorities. According to the Form 990, UNICEF's USA mission is to relentlessly pursue a better world for every child.
And structurally, it's separate from the UN.
Yes, UNICEF USA is independently incorporated under New York state law as a 501c3 and is not part of the UN at all. According to UNICEF USA's own published sources, it has raised a cumulative $12 billion in donations since it was founded in 1947, and that includes gifts in kind.
Okay, so UNICEF USA is one piece of a larger funding picture. Walk me through the whole thing.
I kind of think of it as 5 phases, 5 different answers over 80 years to the same question, which is, what money exists in the world that hasn't yet been pointed at children? The crucial thing is that UNICEF never retired one phase when it moved to the next. They layered them, and every phase is still running.
How does that work?
Phase 1 is government grants. UNICEF started in 1946 with governments donating money, and the US was the largest donor from the very beginning. That relationship grew over decades, and by 2024, the US government was still UNICEF's single largest donor, which, as we'll see, is also the source of UNICEF's biggest structural risk.
And phase 2?
That's where UNICEF figured out how to reach everyday people, not just governments. They used 2 different mechanisms with the same underlying insight. We talked about the greeting card, which was product revenue, a physical good with a price sold at retail, generating real margin. The orange box was something different, peer-to-peer fundraising using a physical object. UNICEF didn't sell the boxes. Children carried them for free and collected coins from neighbors. What both had in common was that they gave people a role, not just an appeal, but a mechanism to participate. Phase 3 were the national committees, the 33 independently incorporated organizations, which each raise private money from their own donor base and give grants to UNICEF. The key business observation is that it pushed fundraising overhead off of UNICEF's own books. The committees cover their own costs.
And phase 4 is corporate partnerships and licensing.
Yep, that's where UNICEF stopped being purely a recipient of goodwill and started being a brand, something companies wanted to be associated with because the association had commercial value. The clearest example is the greeting card itself. When UNICEF formalized the Hallmark partnership in 2006, it wasn't just finding a distribution partner. It was licensing its name and mission to one of the most recognized consumer brands in holiday giving. Hallmark got the UNICEF halo, and UNICEF got reliable revenue and reach into retail channels it couldn't access on its own.
And it goes way beyond cards.
Much further. By the time UNICEF's brand was at its cultural peak, corporations across consumer goods, financial services, and retail were paying for the right to associate with UNICEF. You see cause marketing arrangements where a company donates a portion of sales to UNICEF. Licensing deals where UNICEF's name appears on a product or campaign, and corporate sponsorships of specific UNICEF's programs. So, for example, in 2006, every pack of Pampers diapers sold with the UNICEF logo on the package triggered a donation of one tetanus vaccine for UNICEF, the One Pack Equals One Vaccine campaign. Over 15 years, that simple mechanism funded 300 million vaccines, protected 100 million women and their babies, and helped eliminate maternal and neonatal tetanus in 26 countries. The consumer bought diapers, the child got a vaccine, and neither party had to do anything extra. That is cause marketing at its most effective, a mission alignment so natural that the commercial transaction and the charitable act became the same gesture.
And from the company's side, the logic is straightforward.
Right. Customers respond to brands that stand for something. The UNICEF Association signals global responsibility, child welfare, and UN credibility. That's worth money in consumer markets.
And from UNICEF's side, what's the risk?
Reputation. When you license your mission to a commercial partner, you are also licensing your credibility. If the partner does something inconsistent with that mission, or if the association starts to feel more like marketing than meaning, you take a reputational hit that no licensing fee compensates for. Some of the money UNICEF receives in these phases is earmarked. A government or company gives UNICEF money with conditions attached. This is for nutrition programs in a specific country, or for polio eradication in this region, or for a particular emergency response. That money can only be used for that purpose. UNICEF cannot redirect it, even if a worse crisis emerges somewhere else.
And the second kind is core resources, also called regular resources. These are unrestricted, no conditions. UNICEF can deploy them wherever the need is the greatest: a sudden flood, a disease outbreak, or the first hours of a response before anyone has formally agreed to fund it.
Core resources cover the general operating budget. They keep the lights on and let UNICEF respond to the greatest need in the quickest time.
So, when the US cut funding in 2025, it wasn't just a big number. It hit a specific place in the architecture.
You got it. Congress passed a package that clawed back billions in foreign aid across the board. The piece that hit UNICEF hardest wasn't earmark program funding. Those programs by and large continued, restricted to their designated uses. The piece that hurt most was the cut to the core resources. That money cannot be replaced by redirecting earmark funds. And when core resources shrink, UNICEF's ability to respond to the unexpected shrinks with them.
And the real-world consequences were immediate.
Yes, in Somalia, nutrition centers serving children in crisis faced closure. In Yemen, supply deliveries were delayed. Across UNICEF's country offices, there were workforce reductions and budget cuts. And UNICEF announced a structural consolidation. None of those consequences were about inefficiency. UNICEF was already running at 84 to 90 cents of every dollar going to programs, as efficient as any comparable institution in the sector.
So the problem wasn't how the money was being used.
Right. The problem was that a significant piece of the most flexible money simply stopped arriving.
There are two more developments worth noting alongside the funding pressure, because they speak directly to how UNICEF is thinking about its own structure right now. The first is something UNICEF started in 2023 called Headquarters Efficiencies Initiative, a deliberate decision to move specific headquarters functions to locations where operational costs are lower. Under that initiative, UNICEF has been relocating parts of its program group, its Office of Internal Audit and Investigations, and its polio team to Nairobi. That is documented, confirmed, and underway. The stated rationale is cost efficiency and bringing headquarters capacity physically closer to the regions where most of UNICEF's work happens.
And the second thing?
The broader UN at 80 reform agenda. The UN Secretary General has floated a proposal to relocate the full global headquarters of UNICEF, UN Women, and UNFPA from New York to Nairobi in 2026. Kenya has confirmed discussions, and infrastructure at UN's Gigiri complex in Nairobi have been upgraded, but it's still a proposal, not a done deal.
What would it mean if it happened?
Symbolically, a great deal. UNICEF was founded in New York in 1946 and has been headquartered there ever since. Moving to Nairobi would make it the only fourth city in the world, alongside New York, Geneva, and Vienna, to host a major UN headquarters. And there is logic beyond cost savings. Roughly 90% of UNICEF's work happens in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. So having the decision-making center on the same continent as the majority of the mission just makes a lot of sense. Whether the full move happens and on what timeline remains to be seen. Which is where Phase 5 matters, because the question UNICEF is now trying to answer is, what do you build so that losing one's government's goodwill does not hollow out your most essential funding?
That's exactly the right question, and that's what we'll get to in the next segment. Because of the vulnerability of donations, UNICEF has also been building something quite different on the other side of the balance sheet, a fifth funding phase that most donors have never heard of. Let's walk through it carefully because it's really interesting as financial architecture.
And the key thing to understand is that these are not all the same type of instrument. They solve three different problems. The first problem is the pledge to cash lag. The second is supplier capacity. And the third is disaster response speed. Let's go through each, starting with the pledge to cash lag. Here's the problem. Governments and institutional donors pledge money to UNICEF, but pledges are not cash. There is always a processing lag between when a pledge is made and when the funds actually arrive. In a disease outbreak or a sudden famine, that lag costs lives. UNICEF's solution is the Bridge Fund. Philanthropic capital acts as collateral to secure short-term loans from private investors. UNICEF draws on the loan immediately and uses the money now. When the pledged funds clear, the loan is repaid. The philanthropic capital goes back to the pool, and the cycle starts again.
So if I understand this right, UNICEF is essentially running a liquidity facility backed by philanthropic collateral.
Exactly. And the track record is remarkable. Over $670 million have been deployed since 2011, with 0 defaults and 0 write-offs. In 2018, when the earthquake and tsunami hit central Sulawesi in Indonesia, the Bridge Fund helped UNICEF deploy $500,000 within hours for emergency response. That speed is the point. The difference between arriving in hours and arriving in days is not an abstraction. It is measured in children who survive or do not.
And the second problem was supplier capacity. UNICEF is the world's largest single buyer of vaccines for developing countries, procuring on behalf of more than 100 countries. It's also the world's largest buyer of ready-to-use therapeutic food, or RUTF, the peanut-based paste that is the frontline treatment for severe acute malnutrition in children. When you are that large a buyer, you also have a problem. Suppliers often lack the working capital to scale production fast enough when demand spikes. They need to buy ingredients, hire workers, and ramp up production lines. That takes cash up front, and they don't always have it.
So UNICEF built a mechanism to be the bank. Essentially, UNICEF pays suppliers upfront before shipment so they can scale. In 2023, the RUTF Supplier Advance Payment Window and a companion Vaccine Independence Initiative together executed $86.8 million in advance payments, enabling roughly $210 million in purchase orders, enough RUTF to treat approximately 4.9 million children.
Third problem is disaster response speed. Traditional disaster response funding works like this. A cyclone hits, UNICEF issues an emergency appeal, donors decide what to give, funds are processed, and money arrives. That sequence can take days or weeks or more. For a severely malnourished child in a flooded coastal community, days matter.
UNICEF launched the Today and Tomorrow initiative in 2023 to solve that problem with parametric insurance. In a conventional insurance policy, you make a claim and an adjuster assesses the damage, and then you get paid. We all know that process takes time. Parametric insurance works differently. You agree in advance on a measurable trigger, wind speed, rainfall, a specific index reading, and when that trigger threshold is crossed, the payout happens automatically. No claim, no adjuster, and no delay. UNICEF built a trigger specifically for child welfare called the Children's Cyclone Index. Developed with WTW, which is the global insurance and risk advisory firm formerly known as Willis Towers Watson, rebranded in 2022. The index ties payouts to the intersection of cyclone intensity and the concentration of children in affected areas. In 2023, the initiative generated $4.5 million in insurance payouts across 7 pilot countries, in some cases within 72 hours of a triggering event.
I hear that UNICEF is aiming for up to $100 million in coverage across the program over 3 years.
Right. And then there's the bond market. UNICEF and UNDP have been developing a child bond standard, a framework for connecting institutional capital markets, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds to measurable outcomes for children. In January 2026, CAF, the Latin American Development Bank, formally launched a children and youth bond program using UNICEF's framework. Its first transactions raised over 60 million in a private placement and 125 million Swiss francs in the Swiss bond market.
So the arc from the orange box to parametric insurance index to a bond market framework, that's not just an organizational evolution. That's a fundamental shift in what UNICEF is, from an organization that asks for donations to a market actor that engineers liquidity, risk transfer, and supply chain capacity. The mission is unchanged. The financial architecture underneath it has been rebuilt. And the honest answer to whether that's enough to replace the US government funding hole is, we don't know yet, but it's in the right direction. These instruments exist, they have track records, and they can scale.
So let's talk impact, knowing that UNICEF is not the only actor. Credit is shared, but the scale of what has changed is real.
Since 1990, the global under 5 mortality rate has risen by more than 60%, from roughly 94 deaths per 1,000 live births to 37 in 2023. That is tens of millions of children who are alive who would not have been under the conditions of a generation ago. UNICEF doesn't claim sole credit for that. No one should. It's the result of decades of sustained, coordinated investment by governments, multilateral institutions, NGOs, health systems, and communities. But UNICEF was in the field for all of it. And then there are vaccines. UNICEF is the world's largest single buyer of vaccines for developing countries, procuring on behalf of more than 100 countries and reaching hundreds of millions of children annually, including in places no commercial supply chain would reach on its own. That function has been running for decades. It's not glamorous, it doesn't make news, but it does save lives.
And the supply chain pre-financing mechanism we talked about in the last segment is directly connected to that role. UNICEF's purchasing power at scale is what makes the advance payment model credible to suppliers. A small NGO cannot pre-finance an RUTF manufacturer, but UNICEF can because the manufacturer knows UNICEF will follow through with $2,010 million in purchase orders. The leverage flows from the institutional scale.
Which is the deeper point about what UNICEF has actually built. It's not just a fundraising organization that does programs. It's an operational institution with purchasing power, field presence, financial instruments, and policy influence that no new entrant can replicate in any reasonable timeframe. You don't build that in 5 years, you build it in 80. That institutional stack, the presence in 192 countries, the supply relationships, the credibility with governments, and the financial track record is the real asset. It's also what's most at risk when core funding erodes.
I want to close with the question sitting underneath everything we've discussed. UNICEF was created as a temporary post-war relief agency and then became a permanent institution, which tells you something important about its ability to adapt. Over time, it has also changed how it raises money, moving across different eras of fundraising and financing. But the real question is not whether UNICEF can survive change. It clearly can, but whether it can respond fast enough when funding shocks hit children immediately.
How do you mean?
I think UNICEF has 2 different kinds of resilience, and it is much stronger at one than the other. One is adaptive resilience. That's the capacity to reinvent systems when the world changes. UNICEF has shown that kind of resilience repeatedly, whether through government funding, or private fundraising through national committees, or newer financing tools that can help manage cash flow and procurement. And that's a rare institutional strength.
And the other kind?
The second is structural resilience, the ability to absorb a sudden shock to a funding stream without immediate harm to programs on the ground. That is where the organization is more exposed. Adaptive change takes time, but funding shocks can hit in weeks, and children do not get to wait while an institution redesigns itself.
So the scale of the problem matters.
Exactly. Across 2025, UNICEF and other humanitarian actors faced a much tighter funding environment, with multiple donor pressures converging at once. In that context, nutrition, health, and education programs can face cuts, delays, or outright pauses. That is not an abstract budget problem. It affects whether children receive treatment, vaccine, and schooling on time. On nutrition specifically, UNICEF relies on advanced procurement and supply chain financing to keep essential products moving, including the ready-to-use therapeutic food. Those systems are real and important, but they are not a substitute for the money needed to buy the product in the first place. When financing falls short, the mechanism can work and the program can still stall.
Sounds like the lesson is that infrastructure alone is not enough.
Right. The lesson is that early innovation helps, but scale matters too. Building a better financing tool is not the same as building one large enough to carry an institution through a system-wide shock. That gap is what 2025 exposed. So what does that mean for organizations more broadly? It means durable institutions build flexibility before a crisis, not only during one. They also have to decide, in the good years, how much to invest in future resilience versus immediate program delivery. That trade-off is real, and there is no clean answer. But the organizations that survive over time are usually the ones that treat adaptation as core infrastructure and not as emergency improvisation. UNICEF's story also shows that founding design matters. Its claim to serve children without taking sides gave it access in places where many organizations would struggle. Its national committee model created local fundraising and public engagement that a centralized institution could not easily replicate. And its decentralized structure created both risk and reach, which means governance has to evolve alongside growth. So what does UNICEF's story actually teach us beyond the history itself?
I think there are 4 things. First, founding design matters. Maurice Pate's insistence that UNICEF serve children without politics, that there are no enemy children, was not just a moral stance. It was a strategic advantage that gave UNICEF access in places where a partisan organization would have been blocked. The founding constraint became the founding strength.
And second,
the volunteer mechanism was not just a feel-good story. It was a business model. UNICEF built fundraising through people who participated because the mission mattered to them, not because they were paid. That kind of margin comes from meaning, and meaning has to be designed in from the beginning. Third, decentralization creates both reach and risk. UNICEF's national committees gave it local voice and fundraising power that a single central office could never have built. But decentralization also creates governance challenges, which means the answer is not simply to centralize. It has to manage the tension deliberately before something goes wrong. And fourth, the tools that matter in a crisis are the ones you build before the crisis. And they have to be large enough to matter, not just large enough to prove the concept. UNICEF's financial architecture is real, but 2025 showed the difference between a good instrument and one that can absorb a shock at scale. So the question every listener has been building toward, is UNICEF going to be okay?
Probably, but not automatically. The institution will likely survive. It has the scale, credibility, and field presence that no new actor could replicate. But the institution survives, and children get what they need without interruption are not the same thing. UNICEF's real challenge is speed and scale. It has definitely proven it can adapt over time. What 2025 tests is whether it can adapt quick enough and at enough scale that children do not pay the price of the transition. So the hardest lesson in the story is that resilience is not only about surviving change, it's about whether the system can protect people while it changes, and let's hope UNICEF can. Thanks for listening to Impact.
Like us, follow us, give us stars, and tell your friends. And we'll be back soon with another episode on the business models of organizations doing well by doing good. Thanks for listening.